I'm Alexy Khrabrov, the organizer of SF Scala, and we're here on location at Twitter for a meetup about the past and the future of Scala. And here with us we have Brian Degenhardt, the senior software engineer at Developer Productivity Group at Twitter. And Brian did a lot of interesting things. He's going to give us a talk today, which will also be available at Functional TV. But I just want to ask a few personal questions to get to know some of the Scala developers at Twitter. So first, what brought you to Twitter in the first place?
Yeah, Scala actually brought me to Twitter. I became a big fan of Scala and was writing some stuff in my private time, and I was like, I need to go do this full time and work for a company that was using Scala. And so I looked around, and the obvious choice of a big company that was doing amazing things with Scala was Twitter. So here I am.
That's great. So around the same time, I think a lot of startups, tiny and small, medium-sized, also started to use Scala. So what was your thinking in terms of going to a tiny startup or bigger company like Twitter?
I've done a lot of tiny startups. I previously founded a company, and the thing with tiny startups is you spend a lot of time recreating things that larger companies have already dealt with. And the really interesting appeal at Twitter was the move into Scala was sort of late in its life cycle. So here's this company that has all the customers, has all the scalability problems, but then is sort of forced by their massive popularity to redesign systems to keep up with the scalability problems. And so even though it's sort of late in the stage of as far as success, it was still early as far as the engineering challenges. And so that's just super appealing, is to go work on these really tough problems, that still haven't been solved.
Abstraction. So how did this? So this was your idea going in. How did it really work out? How did you start? What piece of project did you start working on, and how did it evolve from there? How did it really work out? How did you start? What piece of project did you start working on, and how did it evolve from there?
Yeah, it's been amazing. I started, and I was put on the Zipkin project immediately. I was actually a one-man maintainer of it, which was really amazing to take on this whole full stack project and get to see the whole thing. And the amazing part about Zipkin as well is it's a distributed tracing system that shows the performance of all the components in your network. And so because of that, I was able to use Zipkin to learn how Twitter was built wholly. And one of the pieces I wrote for Zipkin was a distributed an aggregate dependency graph of all of the services at Twitter. And so by working on it, I got to see how everything interrelates, and it was pretty fascinating, actually.
Well, so you basically had a front row seat to all the systems because they all have to report to Zipkin.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. So what was one of the most interesting systems you found exist which you kind of didn't expect existing, or something like that?
Well, one of the things you think about is that there's all of these different systems that do all these different work, but the authentication server we have for verifying your password gets invoked with every request, because you have to always, the first thing we do is check if you're logged in. So it was sort of interesting to notice that all the variety of operations you do, you're always checking your password as well. And so the amount of requests that system gets is so huge. Just the frequency of doing that check is so ridiculous that it's amazing to see the request load on that.
So there is some high-performance computing going on there.
Yeah, there's lots of stuff, yeah.
It's good to know, right? We're always curious about how high-performance is done in Scala works, so probably we'll ask those folks to talk about it. But I think this is a great advantage of the Twitter stack, that it comes with this uniform instrumentation. So I wonder, how did this help make Twitter so fast, right? Because now, you're tweeting on an iPhone, I have bad connection, right? I have a few bars, 4G, I'm tweeting, and somebody retweets or replies, I immediately see the notification pushed back at me. I'm actually constantly amazed how reliable and immediate these notifications are. So can you speak a little bit about what goes into making this whole thing happen?
Well, yeah, if you're using, if you're looking at your Twitter webpage and it's slow, we have a Firefox plugin that enables it to integrate with Zipkin. And so if you look at Firebug, you can see each individual HTTP requests and how long they take. But with the Zipkin plugin, you can also see of each individual HTTP request which components of the distributed system were involved in serving that response. And so now you can load your home page, your timeline, and not only see every single HTTP request, but all the different systems that went involved and see the whole breakdown of what took the longest. So that's all open source, by the way. You can get it now. And additionally, we have that integrated into our mobile debug builds, and so we can see Zipkin traces through every single mobile request too. So if the app is slow, we can have visibility into the performance of all the systems and just look for the long bar on the chart, and that's the thing that's slowing you down.
This is great. I mean, I clearly see the effect of this in practice. Can you speak a little bit about your own learning experience at Twitter? What's about the learning culture? And you obviously had a lot of veterans around you who's been doing this for a while. And what are the most important things you've learned and how this learning actually happened?
I think the thing I've learned the most here is I've never worked anywhere where people have done such a good job at following research, but also being pragmatic at the same time. I know a lot of people who've read a lot of papers or be very academic, and I've worked with a lot of hacker guys who output lots of code, but people who do both are so prevalent here, and the discipline of paying attention to research and then going and implementing those things in production is such a common thing here. For example, Zipkin itself was a paper that Google wrote about their tracing system called Dapper, and it described it in pretty brief detail, and then Twitter engineers went and implemented it from the paper and open sourced it. And that sort of ability to go research cutting edge things and then implement them and use them in production is a skill that I've really worked to develop here.
Great. I wonder, what is it about Twitter culture, which, going back to your paper reference, which makes all these kind of people who are very, well versed in both theory and practice thrive here. Like Marius, for instance, he gives talks about the right ways to do concurrency or for treating a data center as a computer and reason about it very systematically. At the same time, he is one of the most productive coders with a lot of open source, and Stu has a lot of contributions to open source. What is it about Twitter open source culture which kind of supports this kind of thinking capacity and at the same time allows folks to crank out great open source?
Well, the scalability problems we have put a very strong constraint on performance in your system. So doing bad design doesn't fly, because if you do anything incorrectly designed, it's not going to scale, and you'll see it in production. Mm-hmm. And so because of that constraint, you have to be versed in the theory. You can't not know all the theory of everything you're doing, because you'll get burnt very quickly. Mm-hmm. But as we are a business and we actually have goals to produce things, that constraint poses constraints on being productive and actually getting things done and shipping it. And so the combination of the two is really the factor that has developed this culture where mastery of the systems is important, but also getting it out the door is as important. And,
That's great. I guess one question a lot of developers have right now is they want to take, the open source which Twitter puts out, and they want basically build pieces of their businesses resembling Twitter, right? Because they may have a user-facing API, which they want to be a web scale, or they want to have data processing, at Twitter scale. So what advice do you have for folks who want to look at Twitter open source, and basically have all this great number of projects, and they basically want to replicate Twitter's success and reuse this open source and join the community? Where should they start? What's a good trajectory to dive into Twitter open source?
I think the first thing is to understand the target audience for our open source projects. We develop open source projects for us, and so we are a very large website that gets lots of requests, and we build things with scalability as like a very primary component of it. And if you're just getting a startup going and you want to download Zipkin and use it, I've seen a lot of people on the Zipkin mailing list, for example, that don't have a distributed system. They've got one server running Ruby on Rails, and they want to integrate Zipkin in it because Twitter uses that. And that's not an appropriate usage of a distributed tracing system that's used to manage, follow, tens and hundreds of services. So the recruiting pitch I would do about the Twitter open source stack is to the other larger companies, and we see a lot of those usages there. Foursquare, for example, is using a lot of the Twitter stack, and the larger companies, once they hit these scalability problems, That's where I would say you should look at the Twitter stack, because most of the problems that people have, we've already dealt with them and we've solved them in elegant ways. Sometimes the elegance is lost if you're just getting started up and you just want to build a prototype of something. That being said, we're always working to get more people to adopt our stuff, because that breathes life into the system when they do grow. So we sort of fight this balance of, like, you know, inducting in the new users and the smaller users, but as well as you know, our day job is to make this stuff run fast and run performant at the same time.
Right. So I guess in order to really understand the value, you have to experience the scale, right? So, and hopefully, you know, the startups get to the scale, and then they get to enjoy this.
Well, here's the thing: is if usually the scale means success, and you don't want to have to stop mid-course and rewrite everything, because that's really, really troublesome. And so, if the deal with what we put out is that it's ready to roll. So if you do get popular, you'll be able to handle it. You'll be able to grow with your company.
Well, that's great. I hope we actually help more folks learn Twitter Stack, and we're going to have a Finagle workshop at Scala by the Bay in August. So please look at the calendar and watch Scala by the Bay website. We'll have all the program and all the trainings published there in due course. And thanks, Brian, very much. It was real helpful.
Great.